Let's get started, folks. Before we begin, before I introduce our first presenter today, well, thank you, Paul, for coming, and those of you who are joining us on Zoom as well. I want to remind us, especially for those on Zoom, that kind of the house rules for our colloquium. Closed captioning is available. There should be a CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you want to participate in the question and answer period, please raise your hand. And we have a system to make sure that you can be unmuted and present your question yourself, or you can put it in through the Q&A feature as well. Someone can read that. And please, if you do have technical issues, please raise them in the chat. We'll try to get those solved for those of you on Zoom. Next slide, please. The colloquium and the event is being held on the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people. And that includes the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, and Odawa peoples. And what we want to really do, and this is too little, I know, but is as we hold our event today, acknowledge the debt we owe for using this land of these people.
So our first presenter today is Tzu-Yun Tung. She's a fifth-year student in our PhD program with a focus on psycholinguistics and sentence processing. She joined us in 2017 after serving as a researcher at the Brain and Language Laboratory at Academia Sinica. Prior to that, she completed a BA and MA degrees in English linguistics at the National Taiwan Normal University. Tzu-Yun's research in psycholinguistics, in my mind, what kind of makes it unique is the way she seeks to integrate an understanding of multiple cognitive systems that work together to facilitate rapid and efficient language comprehension. The dissertation research, which we'll be hearing about as soon as I can wrap this up, is about how to integrate two seemingly very distinct systems: a forward-looking system of prediction and a seemingly backward-looking system of memory and recall. How do these things work together efficiently and effectively? And what she offers in her work, of which we'll hear a part of today, is a framework for thinking of these as two different windows into a single unified system. Her work is intellectually broad. It draws from insights from linguistic theory, from psycholinguistics, from computational modeling and neuroscience, as you'll see. And it's impactful. It can already be seen in many conference presentations and publications, including a publication in Neurobiology of Language over the summer, and well, fingers crossed, publication currently under review. We'll see how that goes. So anyway, I've talked too long. Please join me in welcoming Tzu-Yun to hear about expectations modulate retrieval interference during ellipsis resolution. Thank you, Tzu-Yun.
So thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be invited as the colloquium speaker this semester, and I will be sharing my project entitled Expectations Modulate Retrieval Interference During Ellipsis Resolution. Okay, so I will start with a general introduction of the background, the theoretical framework, and empirical states on the topic, and then move on to describing our experimental design, the methods, followed by our results and discussion. So, in language comprehension, we often need to retrieve a previously encountered target item. And during that process, we may encounter some interference from some more recent or similar items. So, for example, in the sentence, Aim brought a shirt that was next to the luggage, and Emma also brought one. What did Emma bring? Is it a shirt, or is it the luggage? So I hope everyone agrees that it's a shirt that Emma brought. So in order to resolve this, we need to retrieve the shirt, which is the target item, and luggage is the distractor that can cause interference in this sentence. And this has been captured with a cue-based memory retrieval mechanism, which says retrieval actually depends on the cue match of the target compared to that of the distractor. We will have more explanations of this later, But right now, I want to point you to a theoretical nuance that we will be focusing on in this study, which is whether there is an interaction between this retrieval interference and the predictability of the target item that we will be retrieving. So let's talk about cue-based retrieval. There are two kinds of retrieval interference. In grammatical contexts, where you have a target item fully matching the retrieval cues and the distractor item partially matching the cue, you have a cue overload, which will lead to inhibitory interference, showing a slower reading time. So in A sentence, the new executive who oversaw the middle manager apparently was dishonest. So was, the verb here offers two cues, the singular number cue and the local subject structure cue, for you to retrieve the right target, which is the executive, which fully matches these cues. But we also have a cue matching distractor matching the singular cue, which is manager. So manager here is going to cause inhibitory interference compared to the sentence in B where we have managers is matching the singular cue. So A will be read slower compared to B. In ungrammatical sentences, we will have a target and the distractor, both of them partially matching the cue because it's ungrammatical. But the cue matching distractor can cause an illusion of grammaticality, which can facilitate processing, actually, causing facilitatory interference. And this will be shown in a reading time speed up or a reduced P6 effect. So P6 is an ERP component indexing syntactic processing difficulty. A reduced P6 means a facilitated processing. So an example here is the new executive who oversaw the middle managers apparently were dishonest. So we don't have a fully matching target here because the executive is minus plural. But we do have a matching distractor here, plural managers. So these managers will cause facilitatory interference compared to B, where we have a singular manager. So A will be read faster and will elicit a reduced P6. Okay. But not all interference are equal. So we have two types of asymmetry. Grammatical asymmetry says, well, facilitatory interference in ungrammatical sentences are actually stronger than inhibitory interference in grammatical sentences. And we have two accounts to explain such asymmetry. The first one is retrieval by predictability account that says, well, if you have a predictable subject-verb dependency, you can actually predict the verb once you see the subject. And if you have a successful prediction, as in the grammatical condition, you probably don't need to go back and retrieve the subject. So the lack of retrieval need will have a minimized probability of seeing interference from the distractor. No retrieval, no interference. But in ungrammatical condition, where you have an unsuccessful prediction, meaning you have an ungrammatical verb, you probably will need to go back and retrieve the subject. And this retrieval can actually trigger interference from the distractor. So that's why you will have a stronger facilitatory interference effect compared to inhibitory interference effect. Another account is the GPT-2 account, which is a bit different. So this model actually also simulates this asymmetry. So this is a transformer-based neural network language model, the GPT-2, which is trained specifically to predict the next word. The concept is, well, the noisy memory representations of the context will affect how you predict the next word. And this word predictability is formalized as a surprise of value produced by this model. And more predictability will actually reflect either facilitatory interference effect or a minimized inhibitory interference effect. So GPT-2 account can also account for this grammatical asymmetry by the surprisal value it generates. Okay, so the second interference asymmetry is type asymmetry. So in ungrammatical sentences where we have facilitatory interference effect, this effect is actually stronger in subject-verb dependency compared to reflexive antecedent dependency. And we have an account, Q preference by predictability account, that says, well, if you have an unpredictable reflexive antecedent dependency, so you cannot really predict an upcoming reflexive when you see an antecedent, right? So retrieval in this case is a necessary resolution process, and structure cues are prioritized by default. That will ensure successful retrieval of the target and minimizing interference effect from the distractor. But if you have a predictable subject-verb dependency and you get an ungrammatical verb, because this is facilitatory condition, you will get a prediction error by this ungrammatical verb. And retrieval in this case is triggered by prediction error functioning as a repair mechanism. And in this sense, structure cues are no longer prioritized because the parser starts questioning the validity of the structures built so far. That will give the structure a chance to cause interference. So linguistic predictability of the dependency can influence the cue preference during retrieval, and this can explain this type asymmetry that we see in the literature. So previous studies focused mainly on the predictability of the linguistic dependency. In the current study, we want to focus instead on the predictability of the target item that we are retrieving. So we are testing this hypothesis, saying whether the target expectations will modulate memory retrieval. And we have one prior study investigating this. They found that you will see inhibitory interference effect in low but not high expectation condition, meaning if you have a highly predicted target, you either don't retrieve that at all, or it's like so highly activated, you won't see interference effect. But this study by Campanelli et al. Used a dual task design, meaning the interference effect comes from a word from a word list outside of the sentence that contains the target. So we want to instead use a single task sentence reading paradigm to investigate interference effect to better connect with the majority of the interference literature. And we will use Mandarin noun-phrase ellipsis as the target construction here, because at the retrieval side, Mandarin classifier actually provides both structural cues and semantic cue that will be very useful for manipulating the interference design that we will be talking about. Furthermore, we will want to evaluate the three accounts that we just mentioned to see whether they can also account for the interaction between target expectations and memory retrieval. So let's quickly lay out the predictions of these three theories on the stimuli that we will be using. So we will want to investigate whether target expectations will influence interference effect in both grammatical and ungrammatical conditions. And the retrieval by predictability account will say if you have a successful prediction, as in the grammatical situation and with high expectation, you probably don't need to retrieve, so no interference at all. But if you don't have any prediction, as in the low expectation condition, or if you have an unsuccessful wrong prediction, you need to go back and retrieve, and you will have a probability of seeing interference effect. The second account, Q preference by predictability account, says if the retrieval is a normal resolution process, you have a prioritized structure Q, you will not see interference effect. as in the grammatical condition or low expectation condition here. But if retrieval is triggered by a prediction error, as in the ungrammatical high expectation condition here, you have a neutralized structural cue because retrieval function as a repair mechanism here. So you will have a higher chance of seeing interference effect under this condition. We don't have prediction for the GPT-2 account yet, but we will after we derive the surprise value for our experimental stimuli later. And just to recap, it says noisy memory representations of the context will affect word predictability and the presence or absence of interference. So here is our experimental design. We used sentences like, the mother brought a shirt that was next to the luggage, and the daughter also brought one. One here corresponds to a number classifier sequence in Mandarin, and this classifier needs to agree with the target shirt in semantic features. And we manipulated the match between the classifier and the target. So a match gives us grammatical condition, a mismatch ungrammatical condition. We also manipulated the match between the classifier and the distractor. So a match gives us high interference, a mismatch low interference. Finally, we manipulated the lexical semantic expectation of the target. So if you have a verb like bring, you can bring shirt or luggage. So that makes shirt lowly predicted. But if you have a verb like wear, you can only wear shirt, not luggage. So that makes shirt more highly predicted. So this 2 by 2 by 2 design gives us 8 conditions. We have 44 sets of 8 conditions. So for example, A and B are grammatical because the classifier 件 here matches the target shirt. You can say 1件 shirt in Mandarin. C and D are ungrammatical because the classifier 本 here actually mismatches the target shirt. So you cannot say 1本 shirt, for example. A and C are high interference because the classifier matches the distractor. So you can say 1件 luggage or 1本 book. And B and D are low interference because the classifier mismatches the distractor. A to D are also low expectation because you can bring shirt, luggage, or book. If you change that to wear, D to E to H is high expectation because you can only wear shirt, but not luggage or book. Okay, so we also derived the surprise value for all of our experimental stimuli. And we had, for the EEG experiment, 30 healthy Mandarin speakers, all right-handed. And we asked them to read those sentences and answer yes/no comprehension questions after 1/4 of the trials. The accuracy rate is quite high, 80% correct. So we epoch the data around the critical number classifier sequence. We removed some artifacts, and we were analyzing for a P6 effect. So we chose the central posterior electrodes, classical for those P6 effect, and 650 to 800 milliseconds as our time window for the analysis. Okay. So the results. Firstly, we have a grammaticality result. So that means the ungrammatical condition, the red line here, elicits a more positive going wave. Positive is up. So compared to the grammatical condition, the blue line. So this is expected because ungrammatical conditions are syntactically taxing. And here is our main finding of this study, which is an expectation modulated facilitatory interference effect. That means in the ungrammatical conditions, where we were expecting an illusion of grammaticality, you only see this illusion when there is a prediction error, as in the high expectation condition, but not in the low expectation condition. And we will explain this more, connect that to theory later. For the grammatical condition, we see a statistically non-significant trend going to toward the right direction, but this effect is very subtle. And that means you have an inhibitory interference effect on the low but not high expectation condition. So as explained before, if you have a highly expected target, you either don't retrieve the target at all, or you just retrieve that successfully without destructor interference. So in this study, we successfully replicated the facilitatory interference effect indexed by P6, and we additionally found an expectation modulation that is not reported in the previous finding. And for the inhibitory interference effect, we see a non-significant trend consistent with prior behavioral findings. Okay, so now we are ready to compare our EEG results with the GPT-2 surprisal value. So this is the scatter plot, plotting the same results that we just saw earlier. So we see facilitatory interference effect under high but not low expectation condition. Do people want to guess how GPT-2 perform on this exactly the same stimuli? Will it perform similarly with human, or will it perform like differently, drastically? So the result is it does show facilitatory interference effect, but it shows it across the board. So under both high expectation and low expectation conditions, which replicate previous findings. But it's different from how human behaves, and it's interesting. Okay, so we took a step further by conducting a single trial Bayesian model analysis, fitting the surprisal value against the EEG signals. So we want to see if surprisal value can explain the EEG signals that we are seeing. And the result is, because the 95% posterior CI includes 0, we do not find a reliable contribution of the surprisal value to the P6 response that was investigated in the study. And this is consistent with prior study like Hell et al. 2018, which associates surprisal value with an earlier anterior ERP component. So that's our single trial analysis. Okay, so in the current study, we started out by testing this hypothesis, whether the target expectations will modulate retrieval interference. And we used Mandarin non-phrasal ellipsis in a single task sentence reading paradigm. We found, first of all, there is a grammaticality effect, meaning ungrammatical non-phrasal ellipsis due to a mismatching classifier elicits a P6 effect. More importantly, this effect is further modulated by distractor and target expectancy. So specifically, if you have a semantic cue matching distractor, it will temporarily be considered as the antecedent, the illusion of grammaticality, and that will attenuate the P6. But this only happens if you have a highly predicted cue mismatching target antecedent causing prediction error. The surprisal value simulates the grammaticality by interference interaction, meaning we see a facilitatory interference effect, but without further expectation modulation. And here is the moment of truth. So we've been trying to evaluate these 3 different accounts, and who is the winner that can best account for the current data. So the winner goes to the cue preference by predictability account that best aligns with our data. And in what way? So By that account, if you have a highly predictable antecedent, as in the where condition, it will generate a greater prediction error if you have a mismatching classifier. Remember, this is the ungrammatical condition. And that will actually neutralize the structural cues used during the retrieval process. And that will let the destructor, give the destructor a chance to cause interference effect. But if you have a lowly predicted antecedent, as in the bring condition, syntactic cues are actually prioritized in this normal resolution process. And you will not see, or you will have a lower chance of seeing interference effect. So we, in this study, we extended this cue preference by predictability account in 2 ways. First of all, this account was previously applied to English and Spanish, and we extended that to Mandarin data. We also extended this account by focusing on the predictability of the target item instead of the predictability of the linguistic dependency. And this predictability can affect the cue weighting scheme, which will lead to different interference profile. We have further support from the EEG temporal profile in the current study. This replicates previous reading time studies, and specifically, we see a grammaticality effect preceding interference effect. What does that mean? So that means you probably will first detect an agreement prediction error, and then that will trigger subsequent error-prone antecedent retrieval. So that will explain why we are seeing the grammaticality effect numerically preceding the interference effect. And that aligns with how the account explains the data. Okay, so the EEG data, we found that facilitatory interference effects are modulated by target predictability, and this is explained by the cue preference by predictability account. The surprisal value from GPT-2, it simulates facilitatory interference effects, but without further modulation by the target predictability. And we are wondering if this is due to the fact that the cue preference is not present or built in the language model by default. So that is an interesting question to ponder over. We don't have a definite answer yet, but I will be happy to discuss more about this. Okay. So these are my selected references. Finally. So I want to thank my committee members, John, Lisa, Rick, and Crucial for being very supportive, the best team ever. I wouldn't be able to survive without the support from my lab members and my fellow linguists and psychologists. We also had interesting discussion during HSP, SNL, and MLab this year. This study wouldn't be possible without all the experiment participants and our funding sources. I really want to thank you all, and also thank you all for being here today to join this journey with me. And I look forward to discussing more with you.
I'm just gonna ferry the microphone.
Okay.
We have time for questions.
That's really interesting. It's a lot of material to go by, and I think I probably missed this. So I just like reassurance. Your example about the book and the luggage and the other person bringing one too, that's ungrammatical if the one is supposed to refer to luggage. That was built into your experiment though, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, it went by so fast that I missed it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important point to clarify, because shirt here is the only syntactically licensed target antecedent that can resolve this noun phrase ellipsis dependency, at least in Mandarin. And luggage here is the syntactically unlicensed distractor that occupies the wrong syntactic position that cannot serve as the right target for this dependency resolution. So yes, that's a very important manipulation that we have for our stimuli. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much. It was very interesting. I had one question about the labeling, the grammatical versus ungrammatical labeling, and how important that was, because one of the sentences you showed early on, where you had a subject-verb mismatch in number because of an intervening plural noun that was in the relative clause. That kind of thing happens in unforced both speaking and writing all the time, to the extent that where I wonder a little bit about the labeling of ungrammatical. I mean, of course, when you think about it and you go by prescriptive norms and so forth, it's ungrammatical, but there's a level at which I wonder whether that label is useful. And so that leads to my general question as to how important it is to label that as grammatical or ungrammatical.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So, well, yes. So I think this grammaticality labeling is important in the sense that if we want to tease apart different kinds of interference effect that we are investigating, then in grammatical condition, we will have inhibitory interference effect. And in ungrammatical condition, we will have facilitatory interference effect. So that will lead to different prediction for the kind of results that we will be getting. So we follow previous literature by categorizing our stimuli into grammatical and ungrammatical conditions, and that will lead to a more clear-cut prediction for the kind of results that we will be seeing. But yes, this is an important observation that, well, probably people will not find this this kind of sentence ungrammatical if you ask them to judge if you just ask them to speak naturally, but maybe unconsciously, or people actually know this is actually also still different from the fully grammatical sentences that we will be seeing as in this sentence. So I think it's an interesting question to dissociate between conscious judging and unconscious knowing. And I would like to know more about this. And yeah, this is an interesting question. Thank you.
Let me just, I think we have time for one more question, so we make sure Dominique has plenty of time as well.
Okay.
No, we have
time. So I noticed the materials in Chinese are a bit different from English in that the classifier and the noun are separated while the inflection is built in the target noun. So my question is, how would you know the target as it's called in your sentence is not the classifier preceding the noun, but the noun itself? Do you get my question? I mean, the target in English sentences are holistic, are integrated with both grammatical feature and the noun. Let's say the manager. It's only the manager that carries the singular or plural feature and the meaning of the noun itself. But in Mandarin, you actually have a light copy of the information that is present in the target preceding it. You have the grammatical feature of the noun even outside the noun. Do you get the question?
Yeah, so thank you for this question, Jungyuan. I think this is a very sharp observation from a Mandarin native speaker. So I didn't have much time to specify the kind of cues that I'm using in my design. So we are using two kinds of cues. The structure cue that says, oh, in order to resolve this noun phrase ellipsis construction, we need a local object, which is the shirt, but not the embedded noun, which is the luggage. So this structure cue will point directly to the target. And the classifier provides additionally a semantic cue because the classifier, this can only pair with a certain noun. So you say 1件 shirt, but not 1件 book, for example. So this semantic cue will also point to either the target or the distractor. So I think it's still quite clear how the cue matching mechanism will work because of this distinct pairing between the cue and the target or the distractor. So I hope this answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. I need to read your paper later.
I will send you. Okay, so thank you so much.
Okay, those are very pink. Is that too pink? I can make them slightly darker. Okay.
Sadly at the stage where I have to wear glasses to do the introductions. I am delighted to introduce Dominique Canning today, who will be giving a talk, as you see, entitled An Intersectional Approach to Black Queer Identity Performance. Dominique graduated summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Science degree in English Linguistics and a minor in Queer Studies from Eastern Michigan University in 2016. There, she wrote an honors thesis about how asexual people find community online using various kinds of lexical choices and decisions. In the same year, 2016, she joined the linguistics department, and since here has continued to work, especially in sociolinguistics, but even more specifically queer linguistics. She's been an author or co-author on multiple publications, including in American Speech, and in a new volume coming from De Gruyter, Linguistics Out of the Closet. She's presented her work also at multiple venues, including the Linguistic Society, Labrador Languages and Linguistics, and Experimental and Theoretical Advances in Prosody. Her dissertation focuses on actually very tricky questions concerning the linguistic performance of queer identities. And the reason it's tricky is because she takes very seriously the theoretical as well as methodological questions of intersectionality. This means that she troubles actually categorical boundaries like black-white, queer cis-het, or man-woman, or standard English, some other variety of English. In doing so, she brings together actually critical questions, or she brings critical questions to the table concerning how to best understand the connection between language variation and social identities. And this is actually a quite central question for sociolinguistics generally. So I hope you join me in welcoming and congratulating Dominique on her talk today.
Okay. So thank you so much for that introduction. Pardon me, I was like, I probably should have like stood to the side because I'm like blushing. But okay, yeah. So as Robin said, I'm talking about my dissertation research, an intersectional approach to Black queer language and identity performance. But before getting into that, I do actually want to do sort of like a positionality introduction statement. So something that Robin kind of addressed in her introduction of me was my identity is like a very key part of how I think about my research. And so I do share the identities of, or a similar identity to my participants. I'm very nervous if you can't tell. So I do identity, we're gonna breathe. We're cool. Everything's fine. Nice. Cool. I do identify broadly as Black queer femme. And so I added this picture just because this is like usually what I look like during my interviews. And then I am from Northern Michigan by way of California. And I do also tell my participants that I'm from up north. I also tell them that I am an adoptee. So if people have heard me talk for like 10 seconds, usually I'm like, oh yeah, I have white parents, because I do. So my participants do know that. And it helps me kind of like let them know who I am, but also like why I talk the way I do. And then sometimes my brain doesn't cooperate. And that has been kind of a pretty key part of my sort of dissertation experience. Just like trying to figure out how to do a bunch of interviews as somebody with like social anxiety is it's a bit difficult sometimes. But yeah, so this is kind of just to contextualize me as a researcher doing this work. Okay, but sort of broadly, my research goals are to understand how multiply marginalized individuals use language to create their identities. And then sort of more specifically, I want to really expand how we talk about and how we think about race, gender, and sexuality and how they interact with language. And then I also, like Robin said, actually, want to challenge boundaries between different linguistic categories and social identities, because for a lot of people, these things are actually very fluid and exist all at the same time. And then a goal of my dissertation really is not to say that like this is a Black queer variety or the Black queer variety, because I don't think one that really exists, but also I have a small number of speakers. But I do want to hopefully identify some potential indexes of Black queer language if I can. Okay, so I keep talking about intersectionality. And so a lot of times when people use intersectionality as a term, they're using it via Kimberly Crenshaw, who does work in critical race theory and now intersectionality theory and legal studies. So originally, when people talk about like Crenshaw's version of intersectionality, they're referring often to a paper where she talks about the experiences of Black women trying to address workplace discrimination as specifically Black women, where they would run into this thing where judges and a lot of the laws were specific about racism. So the judges would be like, well, the Black men aren't having this problem, so like obviously it's not a problem about race. And then there are rules, laws surrounding like gender, and they'd be like, well, the other women, the white women, are not having these issues, so it's not a gender thing. And so Crenshaw's whole argument is that like we have to think about how different types of identity, particularly marginalized identity, can overlap to create a very specific experience, but also very specific type of marginalization. It's a really cool paper. I recommend glancing at it. And then she didn't actually like invent the concept. So intersectionality has been a thing, particularly in Black feminism and Black queer feminism. If you think like Audre Lorde, if you're familiar with the Combahee River Collective, Bell Hooks, there's a paper that I actually talk about a lot called Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, that is actually all about coalition building, queer coalition building, and it's all intersectionality. And that came out just a few years after Crenshaw's paper. And then in linguistics, intersectionality is being talked about in sociolinguistics. And I think here I just sort of want to talk about like Erez Levin has a paper, I think from 2013, that talks sort of specifically about the importance of incorporating intersectionality into sociolinguistics work, and not just sort of thinking about it as like, oh yeah, these identities are intersecting, but as like identities being sort of dynamic and specific to a historical context, a historical point in time. And so kind of expanding our understanding of intersectionality as it relates to language. Okay, so these are the hypotheses for like my dissertation as a whole. I don't have answers to these yet for this talk. I have like kind of answers, but this is all going to be very preliminary. I have a lot of interviews. But the first hypothesis, just that speakers have an awareness of not only what linguistic styles and varieties they use, but also know the appropriate context and settings in which to use them. And so part of this also is that like there's this metalinguistic awareness, but I also kind of argue that the metalinguistic awareness exists in part because the speaker is marginalized sort of socially, and so they have to think about these things. I do argue that Black queer identity is intersectionally performed. And even though my dissertation and my study do focus on the linguistic resources of this performance, I am also assuming, and my participants actually say this quite a bit, it's not just about language. Language is just one piece of it. And then also, my third hypothesis just being that there are combinations of features that saliently index Black queer identity to participants. Okay. So my methods were, I did 1.5 to 2 hour long interviews. Sociolinguistic interviews are like modeled after. One interview was 2.5 hours, but we were friends, so we just kept talking. So shout out to my RA who transcribed that for me. Yeah, I got an email that was like, that was a really long interview. And I was like, look, I'm sorry. We started talking and it kept going. Anyway, they were conducted over Zoom because pandemic, but also this was sort of helpful because I don't drive, and actually one thing I was sort of worried about pre-pandemic was like getting to interviews, so this actually like worked out. They had a consent form and a demographic survey. I'm not talking about the demographic survey very much, but if you have questions, I can talk about it later. And then a longer interview sort of conversation portion and a reading passage read 3 times, and then everything was recorded using Zoom's like record meeting function, and then the participant audio was recorded in Audacity. Okay. Also, I'm going to pause because I'm asthmatic and I feel myself hyperventilating. We're cool. Okay. That sounded a lot scarier than it actually is. I'm being a little bit dramatic. I am a little breathless. Anyway, I am focusing on the interview and the reading passage for this talk a little bit more. Okay. So my participants were, I did 12 interviews and 1 pilot interview. The pilot interview was very, very helpful in helping me with like question order and also some like demographic survey things and the reading passage. And also when I just had the 12 interviews up here, and then I realized that the location actually added up to 13. So I was like, oh, I should probably include that. But yeah, Black queer people currently based in Southeast Michigan. Originally, I was going to focus in the Ypsi Ann Arbor area just because that's the location I'm most familiar with. But I had a lot of people who were interested who were like just outside of Ann Arbor. So I was like, I mean, a lot of people, the people who are outside of Ann Arbor did know the context of Ypsi and Ann Arbor. So I don't think I lost too much from expanding that. Actually, I gained a lot, I think. And then participants weren't required to be from Michigan. This was an allowance based on Ypsi and Ann Arbor, especially being college towns. A lot of people are not from Michigan. And also there are some like theoretical things that I can talk about later or ideas that I have about like how location might or might not work with Black queer language. I didn't restrict age as long as they were 18 or older. Most of the ages were mid to late 20s, but the range was 23 to 55. And then I also didn't restrict gender. I do want to note that my participants did kind of skew non-binary and genderqueer. I think just because my friend group skews non-binary and genderqueer, and they shared it for me, the call for participants. And then I also have to note that originally my design was to compare queer and non-queer speakers, but after doing an interview with one non-queer speaker, it was a really nice interview. She was really nice. It was kind of awkward for both of us because it was really clear that a lot of the questions she just didn't have the context to answer. And I also realized that I don't want to compare queer speakers to non-queer speakers because that's not a question I'm really asking. But yeah, so one of my speakers is cishet, but yeah, that did change. Some features of interest, kind of phonetic. I have a lot of like qualitative features that I will talk about as we move through, but the phonetic features kind of align with, if you're familiar with research on like gay sounding speech and African-American language. One key thing about the intersectional approach that I'm taking is that I'm not labeling these as either gay or Black. I'm expecting them to appear gradiently. And so all of these will be labeled for the data that's getting labeled. But anyway, word final aspirated T release. That one is often talked about in reference to gay sounding speech. Also, if you are on the internet, something that people actually attribute to Black queer people, a lot of like period is another one that actually doesn't get talked about a lot in the readings I've done anyway. Coronal stop deletion, also sometimes called consonant cluster reduction. I am focusing on TD deletion, nasal fronting, so ing to in, and then voice quality, pitch range, and speech rate. And I'm not going through these in a lot of detail, but like stay tuned for my dissertation defense someday. Interview. So the interview was about 16 questions, and they were kind of loosely organized by theme. I also realized I'm gesturing at my screen and not here, so apologies for that. But the interviews were sort of loosely organized by theme. First chunk being about personal identity description and kind of journey. So getting them to talk about their identity. It also like gave me a chance to like get their pronouns so I don't misgender people, but also sort of set up the rest of the interview. The next section was about identity, performance, and visibility. So this is like times when they either sort of enhance aspects of their queerness or try to sort of hide them a little bit more, or actually a lot of people brought up like code switching in this part. Black queerness was kind of talked about as in the next section as a as sort of a concept. So like, what does Black queerness look like? I didn't ask what it sounded like. That was the next category, but this was also where I asked about like differences between like Black queerness and non-Black queerness, Black queerness and white queerness. Black queer language, that section was where I really asked about like, what does Black queerness sound like? What do you sound like in like Black queer settings? How do you kind of change your language? And then some questions were omitted or added kind of based on flow of conversation. So if people talked a lot about like code switching or not code switching in the performance section, I didn't also ask them that question again, just because it was written down there. And then some people had different experiences. Like I had a couple performers, so I asked them questions about that. And so I obviously didn't ask the non-performers about performing. And then during the interview, as I mentioned, I did occasionally share my own experiences, kind of to build rapport and then also to contextualize why I was asking questions. I also think it's really important that I'm asking very personal questions, and so I didn't want to give the impression, I also didn't want to do this, but I didn't want to give the impression that I was just taking this information. So I gave a little bit back as well. Okay, so some recurring themes for the interviews. These are very preliminary, but things that I've noticed. A very clear centering of Blackness, emotionally, physically, socially, and also in identity. Something interesting that has kind of happened is that I mentioned that a lot of my participants are non-binary, genderqueer, gender variant, but more than one person. And I also actually, as an agender Black person, I kind of do this as well, but more than one person said that, like, don't call me a woman unless we're talking about Black women, then you can call me a Black woman, because that's like a shared sort of history and understanding. So very specifically allowing that identification as it's tied to Blackness. And then along with that, there was a pretty explicit rejection of whiteness. And I think a lot of it has to do with the pandemic. We're very limited in like what spaces we can be in. And so multiple people said like, it's exhausting doing anything right now, and like going out, when they go out, they really purposefully pick who they interact with. They very purposefully decide how to use their energy. And so this actually came up a lot with code switching, where people said like, I don't even bother doing it anymore. Like, I know how to, but I'm not going to. And so I thought that was really interesting. I also found kind of this really interesting thing where when I say explicit rejection of whiteness, I mean like explicit rejection of whiteness. One participant who identifies as a gender variant Black woman, he said that any identity white people have, I don't want it. And that was in the like pronoun section. So like very purposefully, he uses he, him, and she, her pronouns, and said like, I do not use singular they, I don't identify as non-binary, like that is not, those are not my words. And so I was like, okay, I noted that down. And so that was, I think, the most extreme version of that, but the sentiment was there in other interviews. And then kind of when asking about what queerness sounds like, I did have the question about Black queerness. And a lot of people actually answered this really nicely with things like, it sounds warm, it sounds welcoming. And then I would ask like what white queerness sounds like, and then they would be like, it sounds like Black people, like they're taking our language. And so there's like a really big sense of like appropriation happening. And so something to note is that I don't ask about appropriation. I just ask what white queerness sounds like or what Black queerness sounds like. And most everyone brought up appropriation on their own. And so I just think that's really interesting. That is something I want to look a bit closer at as I continue analyzing these interviews. So my reading passage, interviews are not super easy to compare across speakers. So the reading passage is for all participants to do. And then this is a bit more controlled speech data so that I can compare across speakers, but I can also compare contexts a little bit better. So the reading was called Belling the Cat. It's an Aesop's fable. I adapted it a little bit, but I picked it because of its length. It has a lot of the features I'm interested in, but it also has dialogue tags. So there are some changes in intonation as people are doing the different voices, which is kind of cool. There were 3 readings. The baseline reading was read this as if telling a story to someone 1 generation older than you. And then I played a video clip of Black queer TikTok performers, TikTokers. And then reading 2, read as if out with Black or POC friends at a club on Pride Night, with other people in the club being primarily Black or people of color. And then reading 3, read as if out with white friends at a club on Pride Night, with other people in the club being primarily white, with some people of color here and there. If you've ever been out in Ann Arbor, you might be able to identify which Pride Nights I am talking about. But these were also very kind of purposefully phrased this way. One, because a lot of the events here are Pride Night events. They take place at bars. But also, I think particularly the phrasing in reading 3, it's very rare to go into a space. Actually, that's not true. Sometimes reading 2's phrasing, I say primarily Black or POC because it's very unlikely in Ann Arbor that you're only going to see Black or POC spaces, especially if they're also queer. And then also if you're out, even if a queer event is majority white, there will be other people of color there because there's such a small number of queer events. So that was purposeful. I'm not going to play the whole video, but this is an example. This is part of it. This is an example. There are subtitles. Oh, there's no sound. Cool. Okay. No worries. If you want to see this video, I can send it to you. But really, this video is him reenacting like what it's like being in an Uber with a homophobic Uber driver. And then some of the other videos, they're all very story-based. So just to kind of prime. I was hoping to have numbers for my reading passage, but I figured I was anxious enough about giving the talk that frantically doing numbers was not the best use of my time this morning. But preliminary findings for the reading passages, people do read the passages differently. This is something that I pick up on like during the interviews even. This is interesting because sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, I read everything the same way. And so they do read them differently, even if they don't expect themselves to. Reading 2 does seem to be the most different reading. And some of the differences that I notice are intonation and voice quality, but also reading speed. I find reading 2 is often faster. And then some changes to the passage. I did have people who like completely paraphrase the passage. And so when they fully paraphrased the readings 2 and 3, they were very stylistically different from each other. And this was also kind of interesting going back to how people are sort of conceptualizing queer spaces and how they interact with them. But for you can kind of see some of the meta-linguistic commentary coming through, where for one paraphrase, one of my participants for reading 3 said, I gave the prompt, and so immediately they were like, oh, so I'm silent. And then their paraphrase was like 2 sentences long. So like the meta-linguistic commentary that I'm getting came out in that style or in that like performance. And then reading 2 also gets some changes to the passage where people will add like, all right, so the mice called the meeting, or okay, so girl, listen. And then they would give the story. So that was to make it a little bit more conversational, because the question I got a lot was like, why am I talking about mice at a club? And I'm like, I don't know. It's a linguistic study. So just kind of to bring it back to my hypotheses, speakers have an awareness of not only what styles and varieties they use, kind of, yes. They have the awareness that they do these things, but sometimes they're not accurately able to explain what they're doing specifically. This does kind of track with a lot of other linguistic studies where people report what they do differently from what they actually do. But they do know the context and broader situations of like where they use this language and how it kind of looks. Black queer identity is intersectionally performed. This needs more work, but yes, at least as reported. And then there are combinations of features that saliently index Black queer identity to participants. This one is a bit complicated. And I think sort of the way people talk about language more tends to align more with like, this is how I sound around other Black people, and this is how I sound when I'm not around other Black people. And so it kind of seems to be aligning with race, but they also do talk about how queerness interacts with that. But I need to do more analysis of the interviews to get like an actual answer to that. So it's complicated. And so in conclusion, Black queer people are aware of language. Participants do shift stylistically based on context, at least in the reading passage. Black queerness and identity seems to be kind of about community. A lot of my questions were going into this were very like, how does language look? What features are they using? Even as I was saying, I was trying not to do that. But it seems when talking to people, it's less about how they talk and more about like who they talk with. So again, sort of like choosing time and energy. And then kind of next steps. I could have put this better than numbers probably, but I would like to know if these things that I think I'm noticing are actually showing up as I think they are. So yes, numbers, I would like to know if in fact reading 2 is faster across my participants. I also have a lot of questions about intonation and voice quality. I think an earlier version of the slide just said that queer people are really creaky because we are, but there's also some like falsetto use that I've noticed. And then I also do want to take a closer qualitative look at my interviews to answer some of the more like complicated questions I have about identity performance. So yes, that is everything. Here's another bright pink slide. I didn't change this one. Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of. Is this mic, is it amplified? Yes, okay. So we have plenty of time for questions. So I will hand it off.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Really interesting. I think I've like heard you talk about this a few times in Sokandi too, and it's always really interesting to see how it develops. And I guess I want to say I'm like really grateful that you talked about sort of like how you came to your method, and also like how you like decided on a method to like suit what you need as a researcher too. I think that's like really helpful to talk about in this like grad student colloquium setting, especially. And I wanted to like go to the reading prompt, the club prompt. I think this was asked like I feel like I remember someone asking you about this, and I guess I want your reflections now that you've done the interviews and stuff. Like, because you mentioned like you had participants who were like, why am I talking about this at a club? Like, would you do this differently if you like did the same sort of study again? Or like, how did you find this prompt worked out?
So I think once people got past kind of like the weirdness of the content, they got a little bit into it. I think a few people were worried about doing it wrong, or they were like, oh no, like, I don't know if I did that correctly. And I'm like, well, you did it, so you did it right. Even with the paraphrasing, which isn't like how we would sort of traditionally use a reading passage. I think there's still a lot of like really cool information I got there. I might be a little bit clearer about the instructions. But I think if I were to do this again, I would try to find something that was a little bit more context relevant, because I think that is something that threw a lot of people where they were like, how am I supposed to read this like I'm at a club? Like, it's a bunch of mice. Like, so I think, yeah, that would be something that I would change.
Yeah, so thank you, Dom, I'm gonna pull down my mask a little bit. Thank you for the presentation. There's two things I want to say. One of them, I really liked, I think,
how you talked about the methods, and I think the way that you communicated with your participants. I think a lot of the times when we think about research experiments and stuff, like we're often told to kind of like distance ourselves in a way, or not let what we're doing, our conversations kind of interfere. But I think this was, like a really a very good way of getting your participants to talk to you, right? Maybe sharing things that they wouldn't otherwise. I did have a question in terms of sort of like the priming that could happen, or if you have thought about maybe switching the order in which you do the interview and the reading passage, right? Because like I feel like based on what I got from the presentation, so there was like a lot of meta-linguistic conversations happening in the first interview, and then after they do this reading passage in which they're sort of like asked to like manipulate different or kind of like shift the way that they talk, right? So because they were just talking about it, they might be like, oh yeah, I just said that I do this, so when I read the passage, and I'm saying it because I've participated in a lot of studies, and I'm like, they have to see that I do it, like I said. Right? So, do you think that maybe switching could be done, or do you think like it could maybe have a different effect?
So I think it could. Part of the reason I did the reading passage last was sort of I wanted the meta-linguistic commentary to sort of, because I think like if you also sort of like a comfort thing, like if you go into an interview and they're like, okay, read this 3 ways, like I think that would stress me out. And I think by the end of the interview, people were a little bit looser, a little bit more relaxed. I did have a couple people where, because there were some people who have like done research, who are like in jobs where they do research. And I would read the prompt and I had a couple people be like, oh, okay. Like they got what I was doing. And I was like, oh no, you figured out my trick. Like, so yeah, I think it was kind of obvious what I was sort of like going for. But yeah, I think that's also, if I'm remembering correctly, the ordering in sociolinguistic interviews is usually reading passage at the end after the interview. So I followed that as well.
Oh, there's a question on Zoom. Oh, I'll read it for you. It's from Savoya.
Okay.
And it says, hey, Dome. Amazing presentation. What were some features that appeared during the reading passages that elicited code switching that were the most surprising to you?
So I think I think it was really intonation that was surprising, which is weird as somebody who does prosody. I wasn't expecting, and I didn't mention this because I like don't know what they're doing yet. But there is an intonational thing that I kind of noticed across multiple speakers, and I started picking up on it, but I don't know what it is. And so that was pretty surprising. I was also kind of surprised that like some of the like the reading passage went better than I thought it was going to. I think I was projecting a little bit about like I would be too in my head for it, but some people just like really got into it, and so that was cool. But I think I was expecting a lot more, and this makes sense as someone who does so much about consonants. I was expecting a lot more of the like consonant cluster reduction and nasal fronting, and like those weren't the things that were being manipulated as much. And so that was also kind of surprising. Yeah, those ones kind of seem to be, I shouldn't say that, I don't have numbers yet, but they seem to be holding kind of steady. It seems to be intonation a lot between readings that's changing.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, in regards to the baseline reading, who are you asking them to hypothetically tell the story to? I know the generation criteria, but if you're arguing that their readings differ depending on who they're speaking with, and more specifically, maybe what they identify as or what they present as, why only the age criteria instead of something else?
So originally, the baseline prompt was like, hey, read this as if you're like reading it out loud to yourself. And the way people read aloud to themselves is like not great. So the prompt changed. The age criteria was sort of there to make it a little bit more like, okay, you're reading this and you're actually like doing it in a way where it's slightly more formal, maybe depending. But I don't know if I'm answering this well. I didn't specify too much more because I wanted to keep it kind of as like baseline as possible. So I don't know who my participants thought about when they were reading, and I can't control for that. But I guess I didn't want to make it too much more of a criteria, too much more detailed, because you're right that like if I said like, oh, pretend you're reading this to your mom, like you're gonna talk a little bit differently than, hey, pretend you're reading this to your dad or to a coworker or to a boss or something. So I think the one generation older also allowed people to sort of pick, like, to imagine somebody other than just like, oh, I'm alone in my room reading, if that answers your question. But yeah,
Yeah, it does. Can I ask one more?
I think so.
I was wondering too, during the interviews, did any of the participants comment about code switching when speaking to non-queer Black folk? Did they speak about how they talk to some that might be homophobic too, or
Yeah, so most of those were kind of closer to like, it was a lot more like control about like content. Um, and there were some, I guess like a lot of times this came up with gender, where it wasn't so much like what they changed about their language, but like how much they would correct somebody if there was like misgendering, or how much of themselves they would kind of like put out there. And I think a lot of people, this was also one of the things they sort of have more control over, with things being shut down, especially at like time of interview, which was like earlier this year, where people say that like there were people who said like, yeah, I go to Black spaces, but if I'm in a space, then I am gonna try to have it be as queer as possible. And like one participant was saying that they checked their like Instagram messages to like find the link, and they were like, oh yeah, all of my most recent messages are Black queer people, like there's not a straight person or a white person in sight. And I was like, I love that for you. Okay. So I think there's some self-selection that also happens, but a lot of it was like content. Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Dom. I really appreciated kind of all the complex thinking that's going on behind how to attack a problem where everything's on a gradient. Because yeah, I've had many kind of conversations myself with other linguists and just within my own research of how to go at research that doesn't how to analyze language without placing it in these categories. So I guess I have multiple questions, but I guess my kind of big question with related to that is how are you envisioning attacking that in your analysis? So, you're gonna have these sort of background ideas that they're different features that kind of broadly might align with different categories that we've created. And how are you sort of envisioning doing that discussion without placing them in these categories? Or avoiding kind of maybe limiting labels?
Yeah, I guess so. I will be analyzing the reading passages first, just because those are the ones that have like the very strict sort of context around like audience. And so I think kind of what I'm hoping to see is like, I think the features will all kind of show up, but I do think they will be manipulated in different ways. Depending on context. And so that is still kind of a question that I have with myself where I'm like, how am I going to talk about this in a way that kind of makes sense? But I think something that I'm trying to really keep in mind, and even as I'm thinking about like labeling, is like, I'm not really labeling the features by category. And a lot of the interview, part of the reason the interviews were arranged the way they were is because I'm hoping that like depending on the question, so if I'm asking about like what does Black queerness look like, I'm kind of thinking about like, okay, if people are doing the same sort of similar things when they're talking about Black queerness, then what is it about the topic of Black queerness that might be sort of increasing this or like changing up their style a little bit? But I also, this is still very like in my head, and that is a section of my methodology I am still avoiding. But yeah, it is a question, because like, especially like stats, right, where if I try to do any sort of stats, I have to have categories. So this is making them run.
Thanks very much for this. I just have a very small question out of ignorance, and it's about the phonetic features that you mentioned. The first two of those, the aspiration of T and the deletion of coronal stops, I think you may have mentioned in passing an example of one of those, but I don't think I caught it. Can you just give an example of each of those?
Yeah, so aspirated T release is like just the difference between like what and what. So the first one is aspirated, the second one is actually, I think, glottalized, but it's just, I'm really just coding aspirated or not aspirated. So just that like, yeah, and then the cardinal stop deletion, I don't actually have as much, but I guess just like the difference between test and test. So just coding that, yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.